Hello and welcome to episode 9 on a series of tactics and strategy, opponent considerations, and team research. Okay, now the main idea of doing this episode is trying to, when you're in a competition setting, quickly and effectively identify other opponents' threats, how to look at your positioning, how to look at your tack selection, all that kind of thing, and just kind of come to the table in a quick and effective way that will allow you to make the initial decisions of your game be more impactful and more along with the overall strategy that you're trying to achieve. So when you're playing under a time clock at a tournament, for example, that whole setup and that into turning point 1, that can kind of be 40 or 50 minutes out of the 2-hour allotment you have, and then you might find yourself racing against the clock during your activations to kind of convert the strategy that you've come up with. So what I wanted to have a quick talk about today is what them pre-game questions should look like. Having the opponent just kind of rattle off their entire team's operatives, ploys, equipment. I don't know about you guys, I can't maintain all of that within my mind. I end up just hearing a bunch of babble. I kind of tune out, and at the end of the day, I end up missing kind of, the important bits. So what I wanted to focus on was what questions you should ask, 5 or 6 questions that you should ask to help you identify when you're going up against a team you're not familiar with, what operatives you can select, where to set up on the board, potential tack choices, and then equipment. So let's have a look at some questions. First things first, obviously, always work out what you have ability-wise and what your strengths are and what particularly threatens your game plan. So if you've got guys rushing up the field and getting into melee with you, does that threaten your game plan? Does, if you're going to potentially run contain and they've got higher mobility team, does that threaten your game plan? Just them kinds of considerations are really important into with the overall kind of meta decisions that you're going to make for your team. And then the second part of that is the map. The map's a really big thing. So, is it into the dark? Have you got doors to deal with? If it's Volcus, can you take advantage of Vantage? Will the enemy team have a really good time if they've got the Vantage? Can you deny that by taking the Vantage away from them with the roll, etc., etc.? So it's really about considering the map and what opportunities it presents, or, how you can deny your enemy by taking a particular side. And when it comes to the enemy team, questions that are relevant to your team and your abilities that make a big difference. So let's have a look at some questions, and then hopefully this will start to make more sense. I think that these 6 questions are probably the most important questions you can ask anybody at the start of a match, just to get a really quick an easy idea of the opponent's team and what they can do. What's your movement stat? How much movement have you got available to you? Is it 5, 6, or 7 inches? It's a really quick and easy question. It just allows you to immediately kind of consider potential charges into turning point 2. It's really easy then to consider, do you need to build a little wall with some barricades and razor wire? Movement is a pretty big one, and just knowing that is easy to retain in your mind, and it sets up quite a few things mentally already for you. How many APL do you have on your models, and how can you get more? This is a really big one to work out, are they going to be able to reposition, shoot, and then dash back into cover? Are they going to be able to shoot, charge, and fight you? And then how do you get more? Do you have one comms guide? The Jaegers are a good example of this, where they can potentially, I think, get 3 extra APL a turn. Goremongers are another one. APL is a really big thing. It makes a really big difference if you're not considering that a model can, move, dash, shoot, or potentially charge, fight, and then shoot. Always considering how many APLs available and how they can get access to more APL. That's pretty important. Can you fight or shoot twice naturally? Or do you have a ploy or some kind of combat trick there that can allow a unit to shoot or fight twice? That'll help you just identify key units or potentially key firefight ploys that they might have, that they might need to, enact. And that might help you make better decisions coming into turning points, 2, 3, and 4 in terms of initiative and that CP advantage. Can you ignore obscuring, and can you get seek light? These are both really easy ones to ask, particularly if you're going up against a shooting team where, if they can do these things, then you have to be a lot more careful with how you play. So The obscuring obviously speaks to itself. That kind of eliminates the need in a way to bring smokes, because they're going to be able to just see straight through the smoke anyway. Seek light is really important for staging, obviously, into the dark, and in a degree Beta Decima and Vulgus also, but not quite as much. So yeah, these are really important questions for your deployment and your potential staging into turning point 1. And then finally we have here, what are your attack op options? And this is really just to try and get an understanding of how is this team going to play in terms of, are they going to be trying to push security and doing contain? And can is that something you need to then consider denying? Or, are they going to be taking seek and destroy and trying to storm your objective? If that's the case, do you need to position in a way where you deny them that? There's a lot here. There's a real lot of nuance that we could get into, but I think these are generally, as you're pulling your models out of your storage container or out of whatever you carry them around in, these are kind of quick and easy questions that your opponent should know, and will just help you put, yourself in the right kind of mindset when looking at an opponent's team. Then we start to drill into a little bit more. This is where we start to think about the particular rules or play style of the opponent, and then what their team can do in relation to what weaknesses they have or how they're going to impact on your weaknesses. So a big one here is, if you build a wall of equipment, can they ignore climbing distances? Or on Vulgus, for example, if you've got a stronghold right in the middle of the map, can they just ignore climbing? So there's a couple of teams that obviously do this. This is a really big one to get right, because it can really make a big difference in your pre-game decisions. Ignoring climb distances, in my mind, pretty massive, especially on Vulgus. Into the Dark, obviously, not as much of an issue, but Beta Decima and Vulgus, this is definitely something to consider. Second one here is ignoring damage or damage reduction abilities. Generally, most teams will have some kind of ignore damage or damage reduction. Trying to get an understanding of what it is and how it works, that's really important, because that'll help you identify then, should you be focusing on certain units to get that to turn off, or should you, change your operative selection to ensure that you're, picking guns that come in under that range. For example, if it's on a damage of 4 or more, then if you have an option to take a weapon, for example, like the Tesla carbines compared to the gas blasters on the higher attack, you might then want to take the Tesla carbines because you get 5 on 3 rather than 4 on or 4-5. So yeah, they basically ignore damage reductions, pretty big. I know a lot of teams do it, and it can really catch you out if you're unprepared. You think you've got a kill lined up, and all of a sudden it evaporates in front of your eyes. So which models have unique abilities? This is a bit of this can get into like a mandrakes. You're going to then have the person rattle all 5 specialists off and what they can do. But I think what we're trying to achieve here is like, what models have abilities that can change the style of the game that's being played, or really change the dynamics of an interaction. So I would kind of think of this as more like shoots first, or fights first, I should say, in combat, or basically you're looking for models that have combat tricks or something along them lines that can kind of mess up your, like, the standard flow of what a combat would be. After this, I think the next one is to ask about which models have access to like flamers or melters, any kind of gun that can really, decimate a model. I think it's important just to have them pointed out, and you can just make a mental note of which models then, are kind of the threat pieces, and you can keep an eye on where they get placed. After this, these are kind of come down to team rules, I guess, at this point, or particularly faction equipment in some sense, but can you or do you ignore piercing? There's definitely elf teams that do. There's definitely equipment that can turn off piercing. That's a big one where, once again, you might just be able to reconsider which equipment you take into a team that can ignore piercing. Do you or can you ignore injury? Same kind of thing. Then does that turn off particular weapons for you, or does that turn off particular ploys, or does that mean you need to reconsider their movement, once they're within that injury area, and at that point maybe building the wall becomes more viable again. But these are, particular questions that against the right kind of enemy will become pretty pertinent. Finally, we've got can you heal or revive, and which models do that, or models. Generally, each team will have a medic unit that can do a revive and then can heal like 2d3 or something along them lines. Just get them to point that model out, and then you can keep an eye on that. Generally, if a model goes down within 3 inches, they can revive. Obviously, certain teams like the higher attack will have the reanimator, and that kind of changes that to how many times can you revive a turn. So just obviously there's a bit there. The final one I've got here is ranges on the range attacks. I know against particular teams, if they've all got like 8-inch range, it allows you to just position, with almost impunity up until turning point 2. So just this is a pretty important one, but it is pretty team specific. I guess a lot of teams are going to have a model or two that can shoot the full range, and then they'll typically have then, a bunch of like 8-inch range models. Some teams obviously are just all infinite, so it is important to keep in mind which is which and who you're going up against, especially because some of the results there can seem a bit surprising in terms of ranges. Okay, so once you've got all of them questions down pat, which, there's kind of 15 or 20 questions there that I think you need to kind of consider, we can then start to apply that knowledge to turning point 1 and turning point 2. That really should be sticking to what's relevant, prior to the match. Don't try and get the full story of the entire team, in my mind. You just have to have an understanding of how the opponent's team functions, and that'll help you make better decisions. You don't need to necessarily know about every single operative's little unique ability. It's more just the broad strokes. Once you do understand all of that, you can definitely start to make better choices about, deployment zone. Do you want which side of the board you want? If you know that they have infinite shooting and that they can ignore climbing, then you're probably going to want to deny them the vantage that they can get a sniper up there and have, the ability to just take wild shots across the board. Or, for example, on Into the Dark, you might want to deny them the side where the doors are right on the deployment line, because then if they have to move up and open the door, that's 2 APL wasted straight away, which means they can't really then position into a room nicely. So really important to consider deployment. Deployment's a really big part of the game in my mind. Once you kind of realize how your opponent's team works, then you can make a really, much more better informed choice about which side you're selecting. Along with that, equipment selection then comes into it, and operative selection. So once again, if they're ignoring particular things, then certain equipment gets turned off. If they ignore Seek Light, then all of a sudden them light barricades don't seem as important as maybe putting down a razor wire, for example, to stop them coming towards you, or swapping the light barricades for a heavy barricade. Bits and pieces like that. And then operative selection becomes important as well, because if they, for example, don't have the ability to ignore obscuring, then all of a sudden you might want to take the Grenadier so you can throw free smokes and throw 2 smokes a turn or something, or however that looks. But basically, once you have a good idea of the broad strokes of their team, it's going to help you make better equipment and operative selections. Once again, deployment positioning is important. We talked about that briefly, and that really leads into staging in turning point 1. Once you kind of get how that team works, what they've got available to them in terms of their movement and their shooting, then that opens up the door in terms of your staging potential. So you can definitely start to feel a little bit more confident in, like, hey, if they've moved, they've got a 6-inch movement, they move and dash 9 inches, they stage up there, then they have an 8-inch charge for next turn. What does that look like? Where can they get to? How can I avoid that? I need to stay, 1.5 inches away from that, basically. So staging is really, really important. It can take a really long time to get that, turning point 1 done. So just understanding what they can do will hopefully allow you to speed that up and get in there. And then obviously the very last point, denying or contesting vantage. So much like we've discussed previously, if they can get to vantage, you might want to try and deny it. You might, Mandrake's a great example of this, where it's your first activation might be just a shadow passage, a guy up to their vantage, just so they can't just get up there unopposed. They're going to have to fight you to get up there and stay up there, which means that they're going to have to charge, they're going to be on engage. Even if they do kill your model, at least then you've got a model to shoot off the board, and they're going to have to work really hard to get that vantage. In conclusion, version. Basically, as you start moving from turning point 1 into turning point 2, you can then start to ask the more specific questions about operatives or team rules and how they interact, because ultimately up until that point, you really shouldn't be interacting too much with the team throughout that staging of turning point 1 and deployment and everything like that. And obviously you have all of the basic broad strokes information down pat to assist you with that. At that point, definitely start to ask more specific questions about particular operatives. At that point, they're going to be on the board. It's easy to remember where they are and what they do. And that's kind of going to help you accelerate your initial staging, your initial gameplay, help you get that turning point 1 down, and make sure that you're entering the game with as much time as available as possible for actual activations and them real important decisions. Okay, moving on. This is a thing I wanted to touch on because it's something I'm struggling with a lot at the moment in terms of selecting a team that I want to actually run in tournaments. I've played quite a few teams over the last 3 months, probably 6 or 7 different teams, and I'm just not really confident on either one of them in terms of bringing them to a tournament and consistently doing well with them. I think at the moment that's, for me, Plague Marines. I'm 5 wins, 2 losses with Plague Marines, which is, I think, pretty good. But I really wanted to analyze how to pick a team to compete with. And in doing that, I thought maybe I could share with you guys some of my processes there and some of what I'm thinking in relation to selecting a team to take to a tournament and do well with. So what we have is a series of questions here about what you want to do and how you want to do it. Let's start with the gameplay. What kind of gameplay do you prefer? Do you prefer full-on aggressive slapfest games? If that's the case, Goremongers, I think every day of the week at the moment, they're so good with the current meta. They've got a lot of great matchups. The elites have just been nerfed a little bit. The Goremongers are just looking so good. That would be the obvious choice in that regard. Do you prefer kind of shooty teams? That's my usual style. I think at this point, Hyrotech's still looking pretty good in relation to that. There's definitely a few options there, but you need to kind of work out how you like to play the game. Do you like to be cagey? Do you like to get out there and dominate the board? Do you go for, sneaking around and scoring crit and tack, and then mandrakes maybe? But really, yeah. Think about how you like to play the game. Think about a team that suits that play style. That's the first thing to achieve. Once you achieve that, do you prefer a toolbox team that has a lot of flexibility, or do you want a team that can just move in and dominate? I think some people don't want the mental load of having, like Hyrotech or Battleclade, both great examples of this, where one game's pretty mentally exhausting. Playing 4 games in a single day at a tournament, that is a lot. I've definitely found myself having a better time with an elite team at a tournament setting just because there's a lot less decisions to make and the decisions are a lot less complex. So, really consider how much flexibility you want to have available and how much you've got the mental capacity for. I think that's pretty important. The next option under that is to look at your local or regional meta and then have a look at what potential counters there are. I know I've talked about in the past, our meta is so melee dominant and elites dominant. We have a local league that's going on at the moment, and out of the 8 teams in that league for just our tiny little region, 4 of them are the new Tyrannid team. So it's like four Ravenous players. And then there's a Blades of Cain, and there is Phobos. So it's like, it's so much melee. It's so heavily melee focused. Oh, and Goremongers. There's always a Goremongers. So, that means that, okay, what counters them kinds of picks? In that regard, a team like the Plague Marines, even though they have copped a bit of a nerf recently, are a pretty good counter to that style of play. So have a look at who's in your region, what kind of teams they enjoy playing, and then, once again, if you're trying to pick a team that's doing well, consider the fact that you're going to be playing a bunch of them teams on the day. So, if there's a really heavy melee meta like there is around my my area. What is going to not struggle into melee is a really big thing for me to consider. And for you and your meta, there may be something like that as well that you need to consider. So then what team has ploys, equipment, or rules that assist with the 3 questions above? So what, ploys and equipment do you have that deal with flexibility? What ploys and equipment do you have that deal with the current meta picks in your area? They're really important to consider. I think that team rules will come into play a lot more beyond just the gameplay style. Once you've considered all of that, have a look, jump on a stats website and have a look at how the team fares on a global setting. So I know that in the Taming the Tempestus series we did, Nick and I went through the stats and looked at the Tempestus and what their matchups were like. And then have a look at what the bad matchups are, and then compare that to the meta in your area. And also consider what matchups you're going to have to be aware will be very, tightly contested. The example of this I can think of is I'm playing Mandrakes at the moment, and against Phobos, there's a really interesting interaction where the Dirge Maul's Haunting Focus and the Phobos's Omni-Scramble ability. The Omni-Scramble ability, the TO ruled that the Omni-Scramble ability trumps Haunting Focus. So that means that Haunting Focus is effectively useless in that matchup. And if there's going to be a lot of Phobos playing in our local meta, which, the last tournament out of 20 people, there was 3 Phobos players, I believe. Mandrakes are going to just inherently struggle because that takes out one of their better abilities and turns it off. So that's definitely something to look out for. Have a look at the matchups, have a look at how your team's affected by them bad matchups, and then just try and work out whether or not it's worth it. The other half of that then would be looking at retaining dice and re-rolling. This is kind of something that I never used to consider as a beginner, but now I'm starting to really put a lot more, weight behind, because if you roll 4 dice and you have access to no re-rolls and you're still meant to hit on 3, the odds are you hit with 2 dice. If they've got a good armor save, like you're going against a Marine, the odds are they save two saves, so that means no damage goes through. So really have a look at your ceaseless, your relentless, your access to balanced. Have a look at a team that can re-roll, because there's nothing worse than whiffing an entire shot and just having nothing that you can do about it. And I really think that getting access to rerolls is really worth so much. It's effectively worth shooting twice in some senses. Consider the dice and their mechanics that go along with them. And then the final one is unique mechanics. And the reason I wanted to touch on this is that a lot of teams have mechanics that are really cool, but they're just impossible to actually achieve on the field. So a good example of this recently is I'd been toying with Exaction Squad, and the idea of shooting into combat just seems like a no-brainer. You run a Subductor in, you lock someone up, you shoot into combat, you kill that threat, you move the Subductor onto somebody else, you get this little snowballing kind of momentum thing going on. And then the reality is that that's not how it that's not what happens, when the models actually hit the table. As in, it can happen, but your opponents won't typically let you do it. And what that means ultimately is that some mechanics look really cool, they seem really thematic, they seem like they're going to be a lot of fun, but what are the barriers to entry for that mechanic actually going off? I've found a lot of the time they can be hard to achieve, and they sound really good, but on the table they don't work as well. So just keep that in mind. Try and, I think, when you're evaluating whether or not to take a team with you, evaluate how situational their, rules and faction equipment and ploys and mechanics and everything like that actually are. If it's balanced on all shooting, like the Mandrakes have, then it's that's just balanced on all shooting, all fighting, all retaliating. That's just balanced no matter what. That's great. There's no barriers to entry to that. You're going to get value out of it every turn. If it's you get an extra save on a point, then all of a sudden that means you have to be positioning around a point to turn that ability on. And that means that you have to position potentially in an aggressive way. So that mechanic's great, but it's hard to achieve, and you kind of will compromise your own game to some degree to achieve it in some sense. So just keep that in mind. You want to look for mechanics that just work without any limitations to them. Next up, we have, once you've kind of picked a team, considering the realities of that pick. So the more complex the team's mechanics, the more practice you're going to have to do. I don't think I've ever seen or heard of anyone picking up higher attack for the very first time, not knowing much about them, and they're just dominating all their matches, because that's a team where the decision making is nuanced, and you don't have a lot of, you effectively really only have 6 operatives, and you can only, do certain things after expended and everything. So you can't just, I played probably 45 games with higher attack, and only in the last 10 games was I starting to really feel comfortable with what I could do and when I could do it and everything like that. So just remember that the more complex the team is, you're gonna need to practice more. Don't just show up on the day with that team and expect to do well after you've theory crafted it all. The team needs to be practiced on competitive maps to test for traps. This is one where it's like, you think you can achieve certain things, and on certain maps you can, and on other maps all of a sudden you can't, and that hurts. It stings when you realize that, you don't make it to cover, or you can't actually do that because the door opens in a particular direction that denies you cover or something along them lines. You need to look at the maps that are going to be played. Generally, there'll be map packs provided to you before you attend. You need to really have a look at the maps and look at how they're going to work and really do some theory crafting there. I think, especially if you're a little bit newer to the team, I think you need to be able to calculate potential outcomes. And when I'm talking about this, I mean generally in relation to actions that you make. So shooting or fighting, you need to, before you commit, actually do a little bit of mental arithmetic and work out if that shoot or fight is viable, and then before you commit to it, before you actually move the model. I think a lot of the time you'll find that when you kind of consider the math in your head, let's say you've got 5 dice, you re-roll 1, the odds of you getting 4 hits are pretty good. So you could kind of assume then at that point you might get through 6-7 damage. That's something that you should definitely consider prior to committing to doing something. Once you've done it a couple of times, you're going to have a feel for it. But until then, you're going to need to, do some mental maths and just make sure that you've got an idea of how it could go and what the outcomes could be. I think every team has a model or unit two that, isn't great at a particular thing. We'll use the higher attack again just because they're easy and I've been picking on them. The plasma sights are fast and weak. So they're great for scoring points and supporting the team. They're not good for fighting. So identify which units are good for fighting, use them to fight, don't use them to sit on a point, and use other units, use your other units to score points. So another example of this could be a medic. Use the medic to score the point and have the fighting unit, within the 3 inches doing the fighting kind of thing. Don't kind of commit the wrong unit to the wrong area, because then you might find yourself out activated or out positioned and you just don't have a chance to respond. I think it's really important to understand your ploys and when they should be taken. So there's a lot of ploys that have kind of inbuilt little traps in terms of when they're valid. There's quite a few ploys that I can think of where it's like you'll get ceaseless on shooting and fighting, but not retaliating. And it's, you might be in a position where you're not really going to get a chance to fight or shoot, but if you get charged, all of a sudden that ceaseless goes away and you can't retaliate with it. Like I said, each ploy generally has a bit of a drawback. Understand what the drawbacks are and ensure that you are correctly, assessing if they should be used, because spending a CP on something and only getting 1 use out of it really feels bad. You need to understand the CP economy for the team. I've definitely had a few games with the Mandrakes lately where it's like, I've worked out that if I've got 4 or 5 CP and I'm kind of in a good position, I should just spend all of the CP and just have a really dominant turning point and hope that kind of crushing turning point carries me through. The idea of, spending 2 CP and having enough for the rest of the game doesn't really suit the playstyle of that team. That team, you kind of need to strike while the iron's hot, and that might mean dumping 5 or 6 CP in a turn, taking 3 strat ploys and 2 or 3 firefight ploys throughout the turning point and just getting work done than it is to save them. Aquilons are a bit like this as well, right? Where it's like turning point 1 and 2, you leave the CP untouched, and then turning points 3 and 4, dump as much CP as you can to guarantee some sort of results. You need to kind of understand when and how to use the CP, how many you're going to potentially have available, whether or not you should be passing initiative to get yourself more. They're all really important things. And then number 7 here, you need an awareness of your team's abilities and how they interact with other teams' abilities. Once again, using that Mandrake/Phobos situation, there's certain times where your abilities are going to just get hard countered by an enemy's ability. So just have a little bit of a research, jump on the Command Point Discord, Google it, Reddit, whatever it takes. But yeah, you just need to work out if there's unique ways that certain teams turn off what you do. And then finally, the big one, obviously just understand your own rules and your own interactions. Obviously, if you have combat tricks, you need to identify them and understand how they work. If there's any requirements there that need to be upheld. Like, once again, great example is the Mandrakes with Shadow. Shadow's within an inch of heavy or within that little smoke that they can do. If you're not within that, you've got a 5-up save and you can't do certain abilities. So just make sure you understand the specific rules and how they interact with the team. All right, this has been pretty quick, but let's just wrap it up here. Once again, understand your strengths and how to apply them. Understand your opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Work on a series of questions for your opponents to learn their team quickly and efficiently. Once again, you don't have to use all the questions I've put there. You might have a certain team that only worries about certain things. If that's the case, tailor them questions to your team and what your situation is, and then just have like I said, them 5 or 6 questions that you ask as you're pulling your models out, and then the next kind of series of questions as you're deciding on what you're going to do and how you're going to do it in terms of equipment selection and operative selection. Certain teams, obviously, you can ignore certain things. Like if you're a team that is going to be aggressive and running over the field, you probably don't care if they can climb for free because you've just got the mobility and the aggressiveness to get to them before they start doing wacky stuff. So tailor that series of questions. I think what I've got there is probably a good generic start, but you could tailor it down to suit your team for sure. I think focus on the primary factors mainly in terms of like the broad strokes, and then focus on particular threats to your team after that. And then use the primary factors to determine your zone selection, your deployment, and your equipment, operative selection, and all that kind of gear. That they should provide you the kind of answers you need to make them initial decisions within the game. Once again, to do well with a team, you need to be able to consider its matchups and its abilities. To do well with the team, you need to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. So let's use Plague Marines as an example here. Plague Marines are very great in melee combat. They're hardy and they have a lot of sustain, but their weaknesses is that they're slow and they can get shot off the board if they're put in bad positions. So you need to draw the enemy into you whilst minimizing their ability to chip you before they get to you. And you could say that with a lot of teams, but I think certain teams need it more than others. So the Plague Marines are definitely one of them ones where I want to have them kind of almost pretty close together so they can heal and they can support each other, but also avoid them early game interactions until I'm ready to move in my full 5 inches and do some damage. And then finally, you obviously just need to get the reps in with a team. So once you've kind of selected a team that you think you can take to the tournament, generally say at least 5 to 10 games in with them before arriving, just to get a feel for how they work, any little things that catch you out or catch you by surprise, I should say. You just need to have all them things sorted prior to arriving, and that way you can guarantee yourself the best chance of success. Anyways, hope that was helpful. Thanks for sticking around. Really appreciate all the support we've been getting. Mandrakes guide. I am playing the Mandrakes. I am trying. They're such a infuriating team, but I will have a Mandrakes guide hopefully in the next week or two. So keep an eye out for that. Hope you're all doing great, and I'll catch you all on the next one.